Thank you. I just want to welcome everyone this afternoon. Would also like to thank you for the opportunity to present. It's been an incredible time, my first time in Russia. We've had wonderful hosts and a wonderful time both traveling and also here at the conference. As Slava said, my name is Alisa Sherwood. I'm from the Center for Discovery. We're located in upstate New York. Next slide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the center, but first I'd like to know a little bit about you. How many speech therapists are here today?
Есть у нас логопеды?
No? Oh, good. Physicians? Occupational therapist?
Эрготерапевты, ну, наверное, это новая специальность.
No. Teachers? Okay, great. Parents? Wonderful. Okay. I'm a speech therapist myself. I also oversee our residential program. At the Center for Discovery, we have a unique program. We have an educational program for children from 5 to 21. We also have an adult program for adults 21. I believe our oldest individual right now is 85. Those individuals live with us. We have 315 people that actually live at the Center for Discovery. 171 of them are children under 21, and 144 of them are adults. In addition, we have a day school program where 120 children come to our school program during the day. The information I'll share today focuses on the children who come for the day program as well as the children who live in our residential program. Next slide. We also have unique clinical programs at the center. We have a freestanding clinic that provides physician services and also therapy services. Occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy. We also do hearing assessments. And as I mentioned, the physician services run the gamut between what we call primary care medicine and also specialty care medicine. So a lot of opportunity for people to get very comprehensive services right at the center. Next slide. Going to start, and I know several people have talked about this, but just again to note the incredible rise in the rate of autism. This is a document from the CDC documenting from 1975 through 2012. The current rate at that time was 1 in 88 individuals having a diagnosis of autism. There is a South Korean study that indicates prevalence as high as 1 in 38. Next slide. Next slide, please. Autism affects 67 million people in the world. There are no global boundaries. It's not defined by culture, religion, not so much by gender, although more boys than girls are seen with this disorder. The diagnosis can't be explained by having a better diagnosis or an awareness. We're not quite sure. There are many theories, and many of my other colleagues are presenting you with information as to why there is such a greater rate noticed today. Next slide. I'd like to just talk about autism and the definition of it. Recently, as you may have heard in some other presentations, the diagnosis was changed. In the US, we use the DSM manual. It was recently changed from DSM-4 to DSM-5, so there was some more clarity for the diagnosis of autism. But what we know is that autism is behaviorally defined as a group of problems. It's not a single problem, but a group, including language and social disturbances, as well as significantly restricted repertoire of activities and interest. And the slide depicts really that intersection and that connection between those difficulties. Next slide. There's a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to just hit the highlights so that you can get, again, just some more definitive information about the characteristics of autism. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. Persistent deficits in social emotional reciprocity. so that back and forth exchange between people. Deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Next slide, please. Restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements. An insistence on sameness and an inflexibility to routines or ritualized patterns or in verbal and nonverbal behavior. Highly restricted fixed interest. So again, you're starting to see the pattern here, that there is that rigidity, there is that inflexibility. And something that was recently added in this new, as I said, very much more defined discussion, a hyper or a hyposensitivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects. That's something that this new diagnosis just added, and we see that quite commonly in the individuals that we serve at the center. Next slide, please. What's interesting in this new diagnosis is that they've also specified severity levels, so that in addition to presenting with the components that I just described, you're also given a severity level. Those levels are from 3 down to 1, 3 requiring very substantial support, 2 requiring substantial support, and 3 requiring support. The individuals that we serve at the center are predominantly the level 3, individuals that require very substantial support to achieve their goals and to move forward. Next slide. What's interesting in autism is that in addition to what I previously described in that definition, there are a number of other potentially debilitating underlying causes, if you will, that accompany it. These can include challenges with behavioral state, how one regulates themselves day to day. Right now, you're all sitting, paying attention, hopefully very calm, okay? You're not distracted by other factors. You're not distracted by other input. Individuals with autism have extreme difficulty managing that state. And a lot of the focus on our program is how we provide them with strategies to do that. We also, as I mentioned just previously, see a lot of hypersensitivities to sound, to light, to input that we may not necessarily see, but that person sees or feels and demonstrates a response to that. We see a lot of GI problems. We see a lot of difficulty with bowel patterns, constipation, diarrhea. In addition, we see a lot of eating difficulties, as well as sleeping difficulties. Many individuals have abnormal pain thresholds, so that what we would perceive as pain, perhaps a headache, that's not shown clearly by an individual with autism. Instead of saying, I feel pain, or demonstrating that perhaps they have a stomach ache or a headache, they're having a behavioral outburst. Okay? They're able to maintain a very high pain threshold. We also see other psychiatric conditions overlaid with the definition of autism. We see seizure disorders, and as I mentioned, migraines or headaches. We also see a lot of allergies, both skin allergies, such as eczema, acne, food allergies, sensitivities to detergents and other irritants. So again, you see the complexity and the number of things that are comorbid with this disorder. Next slide. What I'd like to do is reference some normal development for you. So I have 2 slides coming up with 2 videos. One is a typical daycare class at the Center for Discovery with typically developing children. And I'd like you to note their play skills, their language skills. That will then be followed by a classroom of preschool children who have a diagnosis of autism. And what you'll see is a dramatic difference between the play and the communication skills in that first daycare class as compared to the individuals with autism in the preschool class. In the first video, you saw a lot of cooperative play. Everybody around the sandbox, everyone looking at each other. This second video, you see very solitary play. No one's engaging with one another, very limited language use, very solitary types of activities going on. Next slide. Just another interesting thing to look at. These are two videos side by side of the same child. At the center, we have seen many individuals who parents will say they were developing very normally, and then all of a sudden it stopped. So this is video footage of one young boy before his diagnosis, and then the second video after his diagnosis. And you can see the dramatic change in this single child.
Добрый день. Простите, вы хотите сказать, что это у мальчика... Да, меня зовут Иван, я отец ребенка больного аутизмом. Вот, и у меня такой, как бы вот сразу же возник вопрос, что видно, это не врожденный аутизм, а как-то приобретенный. И для нас это что-то новое.
What we see is that that child, we believe, was born with autism, and something, whether it's environmental, whether it's infection, then triggers that different change in response. We see that very commonly in the US, that somebody presents as typically developing for a couple of months, maybe even a year, and then there's a shift. Some parents will say that there was a fever, some parents will say there was a virus, and that's when they noticed the change.
Можно я прокомментирую тоже? И я просто хочу сказать, что, конечно, у нас в России тоже есть случаи. Эти случаи, на самом деле, дают множество вокруг себя спекуляций, когда думают про прививки, про какие-то еще. Я, насколько понимаю, с точки зрения врачебной, у нас нет на сегодняшний день четкого ответа, почему так происходит. Но у некоторого процента детей, у которых в дальнейшем диагностируется аутизм, действительно отмечается период обычного развития. Ну, извините, я не так выразился, недоказанные утверждения. Хорошо.
Next slide. Okay. So some fundamental assumptions about autism. Given the videos that we've just seen, we say that autism manifests itself as an interaction problem. When you saw the videos of the children, when you saw the video of Phoenix, you see that there's a real problem in interaction between a mother and a child, or between children. We at the center strongly believe, as I know you do, that individuals with autism are capable of learning, that individuals with autism are capable of becoming communicators, that individuals with autism have minds, opinions, preferences, and feelings, and most importantly, that families need to be at the center of their child's program. Next slide. What I've presented so far is a very complex disorder. Each individual with autism is very unique, given all the characteristics that we've described. We can never say this one person with autism is similar to the other person with autism. At the center, we often say, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism, really speaking to the unique characteristics of each individual with that disorder. Next slide. I'm going to start to talk about the model that we use at the Center for Discovery. Our model is derived from a developmental orientation with the recognition that there's interaction problems in several areas. There's an interaction problem with oneself. I talked before about that concept of self-management, self-regulation. There's an interaction problem with others, the ability to initiate, sustain, and end an interaction with someone. And there's a challenge with an interaction with the environment, including what is the physical environment and perhaps the activities of the environment. Next slide. Again, starting to make the framework for the model, self relates to nutrition and health, relates to independent interaction, and results to vigorous exercise. Others, we talk about social interaction and communication, or as we like to reference it, total communication. And I will go into much more detail on each of these shortly. Environment relates to the approaches that we use, a structured approach, the environmental approach, and most importantly, the integrated approach. Next slide. So we have 4 major program goals. One is to increase the self-regulatory functioning and interaction. A second is to increase interaction and initiation with others. To increase functional interaction with a variety of objects and across a variety of complex spaces. And to increase one's academic, vocation, and life skills using what is an integrated approach. Our model is a lifespan approach. So although we start with children, it's an approach that carries through the teenage years and into adulthood. And you can see some of the components on this slide. Let's just look at it. Okay, next slide. The basis for our approach is tied to the International Classification of Functioning, Health, and Disability. And again, you see the underlying components being the function and health of the individual and the impact of the environment. And you see that intersection by that arrow. It's a very holistic approach. It's an approach that provides for documentation of what we're doing. It's an approach that looks at the variability of the individuals that we see. And it's one that offers improvement for treatment. It's a goal-oriented approach, with the outcome being that one person succeeds and moves forward. Next slide. So our model is called sensitive teaching. And for each word, for each letter in the word sensitive, there's a separate component, which we will now go through. Next slide. So here are the core components. And I've mentioned them several times in the conversation so far, but just as a reference again. There's structured learning, there's the environment, there's nutrition, social interaction, independence, total communication, that integrated team approach, vigorous exercise and fitness, and evidence-based documentation. Next slide. So we'll start with structured teaching. We use a lot of visual information to structure our lessons. A lot of items that show us that there's a predictable structure and routine. So those might be calendars, those might be picture symbol boards, those might be timers, anything that can help to structure the day and to organize the day. We may use one approach, a single timer, or we may use a single timer with a calendar approach or with a picture communication board. Next slide.
The video?
No, that one doesn't work. No. Structured teaching continued. We look at how and when we deliver the lesson. What kind of materials will we use? Am I using a material if somebody is hypo or hypersensitive? Am I using a material that will not be comfortable for them? I need to look at that. And if it is a material that they're sensitive to, I need to build upon that. So that perhaps we start with a short activity. Perhaps it's something like water. Some people are very sensitive to water. And build upon that so that I'm not going to spend 30 minutes playing in the water with somebody who's very sensitive to that. I'm not going to spend 30 minutes playing in the water with somebody who splashes, is hypersensitive to that. Next slide. Environmental design. We are very fortunate to be in a very rural area where we have access to nature at our disposal. In addition to that, we also look at our interior spaces and how we can make those as comfortable as possible to the individuals that we work with. Next slide. It's just a slide of, again, the variety of environments that we can utilize. The water, certainly being out in nature. We get a lot of snow, so we're often out there in the snow and the cold. We're also fortunate to have a horseback riding program, which provides a unique environment and a lot of tremendous input to people with various sensitivities. Next slide. The individuals up at Yale, which is a university in the US, have done extensive research on environmental design for individuals with autism. Some of the things that they suggest be looked at include lighting, sound, color, size of a room, the shapes in a room, the circulation of the air in a room, the flexibility of a room. Can that space be used for more than one thing? I'll give you an example of environmental design in a residence at the center. We have a separate campus which has 9 houses. Each has 5 individuals living in them. They're mostly young teens, probably from 9 to 15, who are diagnosed with this very severe diagnosis of autism. These are people that are very challenged, that have been very unsuccessful in traditional school programs and have really struggled in their home environment. So they now reside with us at this time. In the homes on this campus, when one enters through the front door, there's what we call a transition space. So there's a space with a bench. In front of that bench are lovely wood lockers, if you will, a place to put your coat, a place to put your boots. It's a space where one can enter and settle before transitioning into the rest of the house, which could be loud, which could be noisy, which could be distracting. So we often call it a transition space. It's a place to settle. It's a place to start to self-regulate. Next slide. Another key piece of life at the center is nutrition. We are very fortunate to have an organic farm that produces much of the food that we eat at the center. It is supplemented from food from other sources, but the eventual goal is that we will be able to sustain all of our food through our farm. We also have our own bakery, which bakes the bread products for the individuals at the center. Next slide. Food at the center is based on a whole foods diet. We try to limit the artificial ingredients or the additives. Try to have local foods from other local farms. It's a very plant-based menu. Try to make as much food from scratch and avoid processed foods, although we do need to supplement at this point with canned products. And we try to present it in a beautiful way so that even individuals with autism who might need their food chopped very fine, might need it processed to a smooth consistency, can enjoy their food in a beautiful way, in the same way that you and I would want our food presented to us. Next slide. And talk about social skills training. We talked about all the issues about social interaction and all the concern with that coming with the diagnosis with a child with autism. Our model is very focused on teaching socialization, and again, it's very easy for us because we have many classrooms scattered throughout a campus so that there's a lot of opportunity to socialize. Children can socialize in their own classroom. They can also go to another classroom. There's also other unique situations. We have a cafe where we can have lunch. We have office spaces. Again, it's providing opportunity for people to go to different spaces to socialize, to practice that socialization. Next slide. Social skills training continued. We use a lot of social stories, a lot of scripts. Again, this concept of practice. Let's practice in the classroom what we're going to say when we go down to ask for more copy paper. Let's practice in the classroom what we're going to do when we have to go pick up the school lunches. How are we going to ask for the school lunches? And there'll be practice in the classroom and role-playing back and forth in the classroom so that one is comfortable before one takes that next step to have that social interaction outside the classroom. Next slide. Another first step is there needs to be an awareness of the other person. I need to be able to look at the other person. Can I spend time next to the other person? You see these pictures depicting staff with one of the students and also the students starting to have a social awareness of each other. Next slide. After we can be aware of one another, we want to have joint attention. So two of us want to be able to have a common interest or a common focus. You see these photos depicting that. Two people focused on the same item. So in that first picture, we're focused on Dusty, which is one of our horses. Or we might be focused on an activity. But again, first I have to be aware, and then I have to be able to share. So it's a very step-by-step process. Next slide. Temple Grandin, who herself has a diagnosis of autism and also has a PhD, lectures extensively throughout the US and abroad, she wrote 10 unwritten rules for social relationships, which you have written on the slide here. We use these rules a lot with many of the individuals that are teenagers because they make sense. And just to give you a sample of some of them, I'm not going to read all of them. Rules are not absolute. Not everything is equally important. Being polite is appropriate in any situation. People act differently in public than in private. People are responsible for their own behaviors. Next slide. Independence is a key component at the Center for Discovery. We want individuals to be as independent as possible in all areas. So in their home life settings, in their school settings, in their leisure or recreation settings, out in their community, when they transition to work, and when they're doing physical fitness or they're responsible for their health and well-being. So you see in these pictures working on toothbrushing, a simple task, but one needs to be able to do that independently to take that next step. So we may spend a lot of time focusing on some of those simple tasks and taking away the supports in a very graduated way to allow someone to become more independent. Next slide. Just more on independence. I mentioned using that schedule system before, which you see depicted here. Can I go, take control, and be independent with my own schedule? So this young man is going and checking his schedule by himself. I didn't say to him, go check your schedule. Students being independent in yoga, where they're being told to do the movements, but they're being independent in that process. And you see someone mopping the floor in the gym, again, a skill that we worked on for a very long time with this individual, and you see him without any physical support being able to do that. Next slide. Total communication. Although natural speech is the most accepted form of communication, we use all forms of communication. Verbal communication, nonverbal communication, which is our gestures, being next to somebody, looking at somebody. We use picture communication symbols, both the actual photograph as well as more abstract picture communication symbols. We use sign language, both traditional sign language and adapted sign language. We may use electronic devices. The iPad now has many, many communication applications that allow someone to press the iPad and have that speak for them. One of the key components is not using one single communication mode, but using a variety, so that I may sign more, because that's quick when I'm having my meal, but I may have a picture communication board that has more detail when I want to have a longer exchange, or I want to give you more detail about my conversation. Next slide. Total communication focuses a lot on the use of language, because again, that ties directly back to that concept of socialization. So we work a lot on that eye contact, body positioning, initiating an interaction with someone, turn-taking with someone, because active communication is a back and forth exchange. I take a turn, you take a turn. Even in this situation, I'm looking out to the audience, you're acknowledging through your nonverbal gestures, and then I'm moving forward with my presentation. Next slide. Integrated approach. And this is another key component. All services are delivered within the classroom. So previously, even at my center, therapists would come to the classroom, take the student, and go down the hall to our therapy room. Okay, we no longer do that. The therapist comes into the classroom and provides the treatment session right in the classroom. This allows the student to be in a natural environment. It also allows the teacher and the other staff in the room to see what's going on. So it's a therapy session, it's also a teaching session. So everybody benefits. So all services are integrated in the classroom. Next slide. Vigorous exercise. We have found this to be a tremendous success with many of our individuals. Okay, there were many researchers that talk about how successful it is. We're starting to really document that ourselves. But I'm able to share with you that we've had many individuals come into our program who really had never exercised, never engaged in any type of fitness program. And some of them are running a couple of miles a day now. Some of them are actually participating in competitive road races where they're going out on a weekend of their own choice, of their own independence to run. We have seen a dramatic decrease in behaviors directly correlated to the use of vigorous exercise. We've had a number of children come into our program who are really clinically obese, very heavy. Vigorous exercise in combination with the nutrition program, they have lost tremendous weight and are able to participate more readily in all of our programs, more ready to learn, if you will. My colleague Nicole, who presents on Thursday, will do an entire lecture just on the exercise and fitness program at the center. There's that much detail to share. Next slide. We have to make sure what we're doing is working, so we have to have documentation. We need to know what our expectations are. We need to know what experiences the person had, and we need to know what environments they were successful in. And we need to have a sense of flexibility with everything. Next slide. This is a behavioral data graph. The data was collected by hand and then inputted into the computer. But we need to have this kind of information to know where we started, what worked or what didn't work, and where we need to go from there. And that is also justification for continuation of services. If we don't have that evidence-based documentation, we have nothing to show that we need to go forward, or nothing to show that our systems worked. So design and implementation. Are we on? I'm on 44.
44, yeah.
Okay.
44.
Okay. So again, you want to have that evidence-based documentation. In order to have that, you need to have a starting point. So you need to have goals to start with. At the center, we have goals in very specific areas: self-management, communication, socialization, physical fitness or health, functional academics, daily life skills, community participation, and household chores and management. Those domains really cover the range of what we as adults need to be able to engage in. Next slide. It's just a brief slide on our classroom size. In each classroom at the center, there are 6 students, there is 1 teacher, and there are 3, we call them teacher assistants. In our houses that I talked about, there are 5 to 7 individuals in each house. They are grouped so that there is 1 staff for every 2 children. Next slide. Again, you want to focus on curriculum. We want to determine what is the mastery going to be? What skills do we want to achieve? And how are we going to get there? We need to decide how we're going to collect the data. When I talked about that evidence-based documentation, we need to decide what we're going to collect, what is going to be equal to a check, and what is going to be equal to a minus. We need to practice that skill, provide opportunities to practice that skill in a variety of different contexts. Then we need to review the data and adjust the goal as necessary. If I'm doing something and it's not working, I'm not going to continue doing it. I'm going to modify the goal. Maybe I need to modify the level of cueing. Maybe I need to modify the way that we're doing it, but I'm not going to stick with something if I'm getting 0% all the time, or even 50%, which would be chance. I'm going to modify as needed. Next slide. I mentioned several times the use of routines and schedules. We have found the most success when things are consistent, predictable, and structured. We've also found the most success when services are integrated into the classroom environment or into daily routines in real time. Next slide. We have bi-weekly team meetings. I talked about that need to constantly review. So every other week, a child's team gets together to review what's been going on. What's working, what's not working. What should we continue with, what should we stop? It's a very detailed slide. The point of it is to see that we work in half-hour increments. Okay, and this is it's a sample school schedule. And again, you can see that concept of vigorous exercise, physical fitness, is integrated throughout the day. It's really interspersed throughout the day. And each chunk is a 30-minute chunk, which we have found to be a successful time frame for a lesson. Our therapy services are also 30 minutes, so that works into that time frame also. Next slide. This is just a sense, because we have a residential program, same kind of format when someone comes home from school. So this is what we do in our residential homes. It's also what we could recommend to families to do when a child goes home at the end of the day. Next slide. I'm going to go through very quickly for the sake of time, because I know Sherry is eager to present next, what our next directions are. So I'm going to go through the next couple of slides pretty quickly, but just to give you a sense of where we're going and what our goals are going forward. So what do we need moving forward? We need better assessment and continuing to improve our treatment. We need a very integrated approach for brain, body, education, and behavioral functioning, from infancy through the lifespan. What the center is looking to do next, I mentioned that we have a day program. We also have a residential program. The goal is always to get children to go back home to the family home. We're looking to develop a short-term treatment center so that individuals who are struggling could come and stay with us for maybe 30 days, maybe 60 days, perhaps 90 days, and participate in the program that I demonstrated to you today in a very intensive way, with the goal that with family training and training of the school that that individual came from, that they could transition back home. So that's part of our new development at the center. Just some of the components of an integrated assessment, and you can see how extensive it will be. Looking at a history, looking at the psychiatric and the psychological assessments, a detailed medical assessment, hearing and vision assessments, neurology assessments, educational assessments, and nutritional assessments. This would be part of an initial intake if somebody was coming for a short stay, that they would have this very intensive evaluation so that we really could target very specific issues to work on in that much more condensed time frame. Again, just continuing with some components of the assessment, a very detailed speech therapy assessment, very detailed occupational and physical therapy assessments, and very specific environmental assessments, looking at all the components that we talked about over the past hour. Next slide. Okay. So an integrated assessment process. We talked about the integration of the team into the classroom. Now we need to talk about the integration of the team working together with all that detail in the assessment you just saw in the past two slides. We need to be able to develop and trial new treatment studies, new treatment strategies. We need to look at a family support plan to get people back home and to be successful at home with their parents, with their siblings, back in their traditional school. We need to have training and education for the school that is receiving them and for the family. And we need to also do aggressive follow-up so that when someone returns home, there's a support for them every 3 months, every 6 months, at the end of a year. Next slide. So again, in closing, we have a lot of directions we want to move forward with, a lot of questions to answer, a lot of new treatments to try. The center, fortunately, is a ripe area for us to do that, and we have a lot of resources and a lot of talented people to continue to do that. Last slide. Just my last slide. Certainly autism is lifelong, but we firmly believe, as I know you do, that the outlook is hopeful and that with the right supports at the right time, in the right environment, individuals can be very successful. Thank you. Okay, thank you. That's a great question. We don't use any specific products. We do grow a lot of our products. We do have a very structured menu, which I think is very helpful. And that's something I could perhaps share with you, that we have a menu that our dietitians have designed that really looks at protein and carbohydrates, not specific brands, but rather the combination of food quality in a given meal. So that's something I could share with you later today.
Спасибо. Еще был вопрос.
Thank you.
Меня зовут Залина, я хочу задать вопрос. Вы говорили, что проживают, а потом возвращаются в семью. То есть это программа, дети забираются из семьи, проживают, обучаются, потом возвращают. И кто это оплачивает, если это в этом случае? Сами родители, это государственная программа. Вот как это происходит?
Okay. In the United States, children in a regular school district, in a traditional school district, oftentimes the school district will pay for them if they're unable to be managed in the school district. The school district will then say that they're not able to participate, and because in the US we're obligated to provide services till the age of 18, the school district will then pay for the services at the center. For assessment and evaluation, we're hoping that more insurance will start to pay for that, appreciating that it's difficult for families to find the resources for that.
Спасибо. Мы на самом деле должны двигаться дальше. Спасибо большое, Элис. Мы перейдем к следующему докладу.
And it's a little bit different than what you have been hearing about so far, so I'm hoping this is useful to you. This is kind of a look at what will happen in the future for many of the younger children you might be working with now. The state of Pennsylvania, where I come from, they decided that they had children's services that were maybe not great, but they were available, and there were resources for children's services, but they decided that there were no resources for adults. And so every adult that comes into the program must already be done with their education, their primary education. And they must have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder before they can be admitted into the program. But once they are able to receive a number of services from us that they wouldn't get anywhere else, and it's funded by the state and by the federal government. It's part of an insurance program. The program is very unique. There is no other model like this in the United States. We have one organization, our organization, Keystone, is responsible for all of the services that are provided. Ultimately, it's our job to make sure that if we can't provide the services, we find somebody who can. So sometimes we will have other therapists or doctors, physicians, driving lessons, different kinds of work services, things like that, that we don't necessarily do inside our programs, so we will work with other people in the community to do this. The objective, our goal, is to help people with autism, adults with autism, live successfully in their own community. We believe that there will be so many adults with autism in the coming years that the government will not be able to afford to help us to do that, to keep people in more expensive places. So what we're trying to do is build their skills so that they are able to live in the community on their own, or as much as possible. The other interesting thing that goes with this is healthcare services. This is the part that actually makes us unique. We are our own insurance company. So we can authorize any service that we see a need for. We have a medical necessity process, an approval that has to be given, but then once we do, we are able to provide those services much more, make the services much more accessible than if we had to go to another organization. It's very different than services in the United States, because most of the time people have to go to a number of different agencies, a number of different programs in order to get all of these things. And so they only have to come to us now to do that. And that's very helpful in keeping people in services more successfully. Some of the other things that are more unique about this, we call it person-centered planning. What we find with adults with autism is that it's more successful for us to include them from the very beginning of their services, because they have very specific ideas. You know how we talk about younger children and they have rigid ideas, or they're very structured and they have very special interests and things. That doesn't change when they get to adulthood. So to successfully have people, have adults with autism in services, you have to incorporate that. You have to add that to your planning. Otherwise, they feel like they are still children and still being told what to do and when to do it, and then they don't want to. They don't participate. Most of the time we tease about, you know, we wouldn't appreciate being told what to do all the time either, so we try to be very respectful of interests and needs. Chititi? This is the beginning of the list of services that we are able to deliver through our program. We have supported employment, like I said before, the physician services and healthcare. We also are able to provide dental visits. The dental, it's very interesting. The dentist seems to be one of the hardest places for people with autism to go successfully. And so we have very specialized dentists in our network that we're able to work with. Behavioral support services, and then service planning and supports coordination. It's somebody to organize transportation or special services that need to come to the home or wherever they're living, or if they are going to move out to an apartment of their own or a home of their own and they need help completing applications and paperwork and bank accounts and things like that. We are able to do all of that. We also have respite care, which means that they are able to come to our apartments for brief periods of time, a couple of days, maybe a week sometimes, so that their family members or caregivers are able to be independent, you know, able to get a break from them from time to time. Helps a lot with our families because many of our participants are in their late 20s and late 30s, and so the family has been doing this for a very long time, and sometimes the patience, you know, sometimes the tolerance is not so good. And so this helps a lot. We also have a couple of folks who have come to stay at our respite apartment and have not left yet. And so we're not sure what we call it when that happens, but we know that there is a need for longer term care like that. It would end up being a residential home again, but we keep checking to see, you know, how many days are we allowed to do this and still call it respite. And then, of course, the last one here is recreation and social. And this is kind of tough for people who don't necessarily understand how to turn their ideas into activities. You know, they might think, oh, I like to watch football, or I like to go to the library or like to listen to concerts and things, but to take those steps to actually get tickets or transport themselves there, things like that, are sometimes very challenging, and they would just rather not try than make a mistake. It's an interesting dynamic that we have with adults, because adults today have not had services as younger children or adolescents that help them to develop skills like you would expect an adult to have. People talk about doing things independently, being able to do things on their own without somebody standing next to them watching them to make sure they can finish what they're doing. But we also talk about autonomy, which means that the person understands they need to go do that before anybody tells them. And so we really try for autonomy, because that's what we feel adulthood is. We don't have the luxury of having people with autism always have somebody standing next to them saying, okay, now you have to do this, now you have to do that, you have to get your groceries, you have to make your bed, that kind of thing. So we want everybody to be able to do as much of that on their own as possible. Next slide. The other things, this is the rest of the list that we have. It's quite extensive. We have crisis intervention services, because there are a significant number of incidents where adults with autism are not able to manage their emotions or cope with their stress in a way that's healthy. And so they often end up needing immediate attention, like an emergency room, like it would be for a medical problem, but it would be psychiatric. And then we have non-medical transportation, family counseling. We do everything we can to provide the family or the caregivers. Sometimes it's a spouse. We have several folks in the program who are married and have children of their own, but they still participate in the program. So we include as many of the family members or caregivers as possible. And we work to create a network of support in the community. Sometimes it's representative of their church. Sometimes they have other groups they're affiliated with that they're able to get support from, and build that network of social support in the community like we would do for ourselves. The physical therapy, sometimes we have folks who have medical needs where physical therapy is part of the process. We can also do speech and occupational therapy. We just don't have those folks on staff right now. That's one of the things that we're looking at adding more of in the future. And then individual counseling. One of the things that was not really expected when the program started 5 years ago was that so many adults would need individual counseling. But many of them have had very negative experiences in their lifetime and have had so much trouble communicating that they really do benefit from that counseling, as long as it's a person who understands how to accommodate the cognitive differences for people with autism. And then in-home services, what that means is that we can help people in their own homes. We can do things like support their ability to do daily cleaning and chores, household activities, daily living activities. As much as possible, we are able to do that too. Next slide, please. What I wanted to do here was give you some guidelines to think about. It's very difficult for someone such as myself to be able to give you specific information for each person that you might know already. And so sometimes these guidelines are more effective, and then I'm hoping you can take this information and go back to your own communities and use it more successfully. The characteristics and the history of the individual themselves is extremely important. I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail, but the actual person themselves, you cannot make any assumptions, you cannot make generalizations about how to work with an adult with autism, because they're all very individual and they know that. And they can tell, and they will happily tell you, I've been told many times, I don't do that, I don't like that, or I like this, you know, you have to help me do it this way, that kind of, they're really quite good at knowing what they need in many cases if you just give them an opportunity to show you. Consensus or agreement among team members. And teams for us include family members. And this, especially for adults with autism, this is a very challenging point. This might be the most difficult thing that we deal with. And I have a 25-year-old son of my own that has Asperger's syndrome, and so I understand the fear that families feel and the exhaustion that they feel sometimes. But even though they're adults, you still want to protect them, and you want them to be happy. And so sometimes getting families to agree that building skills and being independent is not going to produce negative outcomes. It's a risk that people have to take. They have to be willing to trust a little bit. And sometimes it's very difficult for families to be able to give that up. The cohort effect, the influence of the cohort. What I mean here is really kind of an interesting thing, because this is this in particular is interesting to do. I'm hoping that younger children today, when they get to be adults, they will have more skills. They will require less help in many cases from us, because they have had the benefit of these years where we were trying to identify how to develop skills and be successful with younger children and teenagers. But right now, our adults don't really have that, and neither do our teens. Our teens are in most cases in that same category where the services they've had have not maybe been the best that they could be, or developed skills in a meaningful way. The realistic and meaningful outcomes, I put this up here because I urge everybody to think about when you write goals, or when you think about goals for adults with autism, being able to fold towels correctly, and I don't make things up, I just report them, but thinking of things sometimes that I see in the United States on treatment plans or education plans, service plans. Sometimes what I find is that they are full of things that I could teach a 5-year-old to do, and may not always benefit their adult life. But people think it's very important for them to learn to be very specific about how they fold towels, or how many times they take the trash out each week, things like that. And what I encourage everybody to think about is the quality of life. Do they really need to know those things, and will it make a huge difference, or will it open doors for more skills to develop? You know, how important is it? Everything that you put down there that they need to work on, I would encourage you to take a minute to think about those kinds of things, because really what you're looking at is a long-term lifespan of skills and activities and capacity to enjoy themselves. And so I encourage you to think beyond the little tiny bits of everyday life that we can control so thoroughly. And the last one, systemic responsiveness and community resources. This is true for everybody. It doesn't make any difference where you are, even in the states where services are more advanced or more developed. You know, in Pennsylvania, we'd like to think we have some pretty sophisticated services, especially because we have this particular program. But not everybody has access to it. Right now, we have, it's not quite 150 adults that will be able to access this program, and then for more of them to access it successfully, that will require the state and the federal government to give us more money. We believe that we will be able to show that it's less money in the long run to do this than it is to try to service individuals at home or in large institutions or in very large residential facilities. But we haven't been around long enough to be able to prove that just yet. Next slide. These are some of, when we talk about the individual characteristics and the person's history, these are some of the more specific issues that we look at. The cognitive skill profile. We want to see how well can they process information. What is the comprehension? How much do they understand? And what you're going to find with adults is you assume, especially because lots of them can talk like they understand, but they actually really don't. To do it on their own, to be autonomous in problem solving, they would not be able to do that like you would expect an adult to. And a lot of times what happens now is that creates a behavior problem at that moment where you're trying to encourage them or sometimes even force them to be able to do things that they can't. And then people wonder why it is they've had the behavior problem. So you need to know these things. You need to be able to understand just how capable are they cognitively. Same thing with adaptive or everyday life skills. The adaptive skills we believe are a better measure of daily functioning capacity than cognitive capacity. IQ is not as helpful in adults with autism as their ability to manage their everyday life. Access to services in younger years. Sometimes I see people who are 30, 40 years old and have never had services, or they've had services that were begun because they were identified with a mental health disorder instead of autism. It happens a lot, especially with the older adults. Sometimes they will say they have been labeled with bipolar disorder or anxiety or sometimes schizophrenia, sometimes conduct disorders, you know, all sorts of things that people, because they were older, they don't think, oh, that must be autism too. You know, and so they describe the behavior that they see from this person, but they don't stand back and add all of that up to see, could it be autism? The previous diagnoses, again, I touched on that a little bit, and what happens when you have all of those, when you see that list of diagnoses for people, you start to think to yourself, oh my gosh, we're going to really have trouble with this one, or we're going to make negative choices maybe because there's so much history here that may or may not be right. And exposure to trauma. People with autism, adults with autism, have had lots of years of exposure to very negative interactions with other people. They don't expect or understand the negative interactions. And so it ends up over time almost being its own trauma where they will do everything they can to avoid another unpredictable interaction with a person. They would like for them to turn out positively, but lots of times they don't. And they don't understand that until it's too late. The expectations of the individuals and the families and the caregivers and the extended support network, what I find most of the time is that there are more expectations. It's either too much or none at all. You know, oh, they have autism, they can't do anything. Never mind. And that's not true. We know that's not true. We don't know how much in some cases, but we know that idea that they can never learn or they can never develop or never be included in activities is not right. Some of the implications of the some of the implications of these characteristics. What does that mean in real life for adults who need programming? Next slide, please. What we know is, at least right now, even if adults have more skills, more cognitive capacity, and are more articulate and able to learn, they are often at home and are at home for many, many years longer than typically developing people would be. And as many as 80% of them have been found to still be doing this, or even if they are independent, they are not independent in a way that they can sustain themselves financially. They require help either from their family members or from local programming. Next slide. The importance of work as adults. We often say that work, and that may not be true culturally here. In the United States, we talk about work defines us as adults. When children are growing up, school is their work, learning is their work. But at least in our culture, we talk about how work is what adults do, and it defines us. It helps us to be who we are. But people with autism are not inherently good at keeping jobs. Adults with autism right now are not good at keeping jobs. Lots of times they can get the job, but they can't keep the job. And it's not because of skills, because they can be taught skills and they can learn all of these things. What it is because of the social environment. They really struggle with the social expectations, and that's what is the most difficult for them to overcome in a work setting. They just don't have the adult, a 25-year-old framework for understanding, or a 35-year-old understanding of expectations at work. The history, their expectations are very different. In many cases, their expectations are still very much as though they were younger children, socially. Next slide. The importance of community. This might be one of the most difficult things to look at for people with autism spectrum disorders. In the States, we are very good at isolating people who have differences. Not all the time, but the systems themselves. We create different systems, and we know that is not sustainable on the long term. We know that the resources will not be there forever to do this, especially with the numbers of children who are going to eventually be adults with autism. So we look at the importance of community and how we can teach younger adolescents and teach the transitioning adolescents and adults to develop their own sense of community, to find hobbies and activities and interests, things that they enjoy, that they can go out and do and contribute to the community. Often we talk about people with autism as being antisocial, as not being friendly or not being interested in that, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Most people with autism would really very much like to have friends. They're just not very good at doing that. Or the relationships that they do have are different. They have a different meaning. They're very attached to the relationships. They're very interested in the relationships, but they express it differently, and it sounds unusual. It sounds different than what we are used to expecting socially. Next slide. Some of the things that we do to try to get agreement in the group, among the team members, because this can become a very lively, the expression I use is a lively and colorful conversation. People are very passionate about what they believe the adults should be doing. Sometimes it's very passionate about, we want them to continue to behave like children, be taught what to do in a very structured environment, and not make choices or decisions on their own. And we don't necessarily think that's the best way for us to encourage them to become more independent in their communities. So we use what's called self-determination, or the person-centered planning again. This allows them the opportunity for contributing to their own programming. There are lots of ways that this can be done, but the important part about this, very specifically, the important part about this is for adults with autism is that they have the chance to contribute and that they know that their interests have been taken into account when their programming is designed. Otherwise, they're not going to be part of it. I know that as an adult myself, I would feel like I was not motivated or was not interested in participating. If I didn't have some choice in my life, I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't be happy with what I had to do. I would feel like I was stuck and that I was not valued. And so we want people with autism, like everybody else, to feel like they can contribute and can participate and are able to participate in the development of their own programming. Relationships with the individuals themselves. This is a very controversial conversation to have. I'm a social worker by trade, by education. But I'm one of those people, and I guess maybe it's because I have a son of my own, that the more normal you can behave, the more personable, the more interested you are, the more respect and common dignity that you can show, the more successful you will be in your relationship. And sometimes people have a very difficult time allowing that to occur, especially in a therapeutic setting, because we believe that there must be a very specific boundary that cannot be crossed and cannot be feel casual and feel comfortable, that it must be very formal. And sometimes that does not foster enough of a relationship that the person is willing to trust you to do anything new. They've had a lot of experiences before, by the time they get to adults, but by the time they get to the services for adults, they've had an awful lot of experiences. I always joke with our staff saying, we are probably number 115 in the list of providers that this person has had before they came to us over their lifetime, because they are adults. And they expect people like us to come and go, and they don't have a relationship. And every time one of those people comes and goes, it's another loss for them. So we can continue to have our boundaries, we can continue to be objective, but we can try to create a relationship that's a good role model for them when they are trying to relate to other people. Capacity and competency of the support providers. This by itself is a real challenge. It's very difficult to train people. It's fun, sometimes we tease about how we have to apply some of the same principles with staff that we do with our participants. Behavior analysis. Behavior is behavior. It doesn't matter who it is, So we sometimes have to think very carefully about how can we teach the staff to best do the interventions that we need our participants to have access to. And sometimes people will sit, we know that just hearing the information and moving on doesn't really stick with most people. So we have to have coaching and follow up and make sure that we are collecting evidence as to whether or not it's actually working, whether we're successful at it. And then relationships with the caregivers and the extended support networks. I often have these conversations because in the United States at age 18, children become legal adults. And at that moment, we are no longer able to talk to the family members about their services or their health or their ideas or emotions they've expressed and all that stuff. And unless the family has thought ahead of time to get guardianship, we call it, so that they are still their legal representative, we can no longer talk to them. The adult must then give permission. And in many cases, we're working with people who are not interested in having their family members participate as often as you might think. It's a lot of experience and history and negativity that is attached to that. So we have to work very closely with the family members. I talked to an older gentleman not too long ago whose married son is in our program, and he believes that the son's wife is pushing him to make decisions that excludes this fellow, his parents. He's a grown man, he has a wife and children, and his father is not his legal guardian. And so he insisted that I must force this young man to allow us to talk to his dad. And as much as I would have liked to be able to help, I said, I'm sorry, I cannot do that. He is a legal adult of his own, and his wife is his closest relative legally. And so if they say we can't, we can't. We'll make sure we have the conversation. We will make sure that he is not being pressured. But if that is the choice he's made currently, I can't force him to do anything differently. And it's a very uncomfortable and sometimes unproductive conversation or choice to make, because sometimes those family members can be very helpful. It's just that it's the legalities of this, and we can't even talk to them, really. Technically, I probably shouldn't have even had the conversation with them, but it was long enough to say, I'm sorry, this is what I'm bound to do. Next slide, please. Okay. What I wanted to show you here were some of the actual benefits that we know that the person-centered or self-determined services would have. Now, I also want to be very clear, when I talk about having person-centered or self-determined services, I do not mean that everything in the program is turned over to the individuals, to the participants. I don't know if you have the expression here, but you're not giving up the keys to the kingdom. It's still managed by the staff in the program, still able to be directed by the staff in the program, but it includes the other folks involved. Authority and accountability. You're actually, sometimes services feel like the person who gets the services is actually working for us. We're in charge and they're not. And so this kind of changes that to they're at least a little bit in charge. They have a say in what goes on, and that we actually do work for them because that's what we believe to be true. Individualized person-directed support planning. It's not the same model for everybody. All those services I showed you earlier, not everybody gets all of them. They only get what they need right then and there, and sometimes that can change from one day to the next. Selection of training and supervision for the support providers. If a participant wants to do something different that we've never done before, it's our obligation to train our staff to be able to successfully do that with them. The benefits for the health insurance, like I said, we're our own health insurance company in addition to being the provider. And so the frequency and the speed with which we can deliver those services is way more successful than a traditional program. We don't have a lot of research about aging adults with autism because most of those people currently have spent many years in institutions. And so what we're trying to do is to create a situation where people with autism, adults with autism, get more consistent, more effective medical care. Because most of the time they don't go to a doctor unless they have an emergency. We also provide a number of ways to monitor the quality of the services. This is incredibly important because because we do everything in the community, And you know that if you're in the office, I know when I'm in the office most of the time, I know where people are supposed to be, and I know what they're supposed to be doing, the staff are supposed to be doing, but I can't always promise or prove that unless we involve the participants in evaluating the quality of the service. So we regularly are able to survey them and to ask questions and to look for evidence that service took place, that service was successful, that new skills are being built. Next slide. A few more benefits that we have found from the person-centered or the self-determined programming. Satisfaction with services goes up. And it actually does matter when they're adults. When they're children, we can sort of make them do what we need them to do. But as adults, you can't. And so if they are satisfied, they will come back. They will engage more often, and they will learn more. Productivity and employment. People with autism, adults with autism, are able to be more successfully employed, able to be more productive and engaged in their community when these kinds of services are available. In our culture, what we talk about here is the cohort effect. It's hard for some of us, the older folks here in the room, to think about. There are children today who have never known a phone that is on the wall, attached to the wall, instead of one of our little bitty cell phones, or they've never known never known anything but having the internet. People who were autistic before we knew how to label them autistic. Lots of people like that. Yesterday you heard Brian King talk about the history of the diagnosis. This goes back hundreds of years in many descriptions. And so there are people who have been out there and who have lived a full life with having been autistic, and we just didn't know that or identify them or call them that. And adults, when you're talking about services for adults today, this is really important to think about because their experiences will be different and hopefully teach us what needs to happen for the younger generations who are growing up. But then we have to look at the kinds of services and the technology and the ability to more successfully intervene and hope that we can improve the outcomes for adults moving forward. The last one on this, the last bullet on here that talk about people born before or after the use of institutions. I just wanted to talk about this for a minute because we have a young man that we work with right now. He's the one that came to our respite apartment and has not left yet. He's been there far longer than I'm pretty sure respite's supposed to be. He's very young in the grand scheme. He's 23 or 24, and he has always lived with a very controlling family member, but a year ago, his father died. And then over this summer, his mother threw him out, is the expression that we use. His mother said he can no longer live there. And so basically he has lost his family in the last 12 months, and he now lives in our respite apartment. This is the first time in his life where his every move and every thought and every choice was not made for him. And he's almost gone from complete supervision and control and conforming to other people's expectations to almost none of that compared to what he had. And I have to tell you, he's a nice enough guy and he's harmless, but his behavior is as odd as it can be when he tries to engage with other people because he's never learned how to do that successfully. And so he engages with other people. He attempts to engage with other people in ways that are odd. is really the best word. Sometimes they look scary, but he's attempting to initiate a conversation or contact, and sometimes he will say things that he doesn't realize are socially inappropriate, socially unacceptable. And so we're working with him very hard, but it's almost as though we are taking a young child and teaching them to be independent enough to make those decisions on his own. He has spent his entire life having somebody else do it for him. And so now we're trying to help him with that adjustment. Next slide, please. Are there any folks here who work with girls with autism? Girls or women? We have a growing population of girls and women with autism in the United States that are actively being more identified. 12, 13 years ago, I was director of an organization called the Asperger Syndrome Coalition of the U.S. And we had, so Alice mentioned Temple Grandin earlier, some of the more famous individuals with autism that we know about. And Temple at the time was the only woman in the United States that was known to have autism that people could recognize her name. Now we have a number of women who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s who have autism that we know about and look at as role models for some of the younger girls. I wanted to bring this up specifically because there are women that we meet every day. Sometimes they'll bring their children in, their younger children in to be diagnosed or to get services, and you realize through that conversation, that history process, that it's them, that they have the autism, and that they've figured out, you know, they've had children, they've had jobs, they've had a life and all that stuff, but they've had unusual experiences too, and they have characteristics or behaviors that you wouldn't think would be anything unusual until you come to a place that knows about autism, and then you think, oh my gosh, you know, because talk about genetics and the inherited traits of autism, and sometimes they are the genetic tree from which these children sprang, and they have very different needs, and that's a problem because everything about autism right now is about the male of the species. Diagnostic criteria, the interventions, the majority is so completely male that you have to look at that. You have to think about things like female health, like having babies, making sure that they are protected against being victimized, sexuality. And it's a very uncomfortable, it's funny, for as progressive and open-minded as we like to think we are in the United States, if you want to make people uncomfortable, you bring up the subject about people with autism being sexual beings like any other human. It just doesn't go very well. Everybody gets nervous. No, they have autism, they don't have sex. So that's one of the things that we like to emphasize to make sure that people understand, oh, yes, they do. It's a biological part of our world. You can't stop it. And so how can we best support them and keep them safe and help them to be adults who are healthy and adjusted? Next slide, please. When we get to the meaningful outcomes, are there anybody here that works with adults now? Yay! Oh, thank you. Спасибо. Do you measure outcomes or goals for them now?
Когда работаем со взрослыми, мы все-таки ставим ближайшие задачи. Это самообслуживание, это приобретение каких-то элементарных навыков гигиены. И пока мы находимся в такой стадии, когда мы учимся оценивать результаты методом проб и ошибок, в принципе, так.
Yes. I appreciate you contributing to the conversation. And yes, you are right in that sometimes you have to you have to measure even the smallest of activities to see progress, to see skill development, and to make sure that you know that that is a skill that has been mastered, is what has been acquired and is functional to that person. What we know is that adults with autism are often able to talk, and actually they pick this up a lot younger than that. There are lots of kids and young adults with autism. You can ask them, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what do you want to work on next? And they can just blurt. They can talk very quickly about things they've been told they should do. Oh, I will get married. I will have children. I will have a job somewhere. I can live on my own. And so when people talk like that, we assume that they truly functionally understand what that means and how to go about that. And oftentimes that's not true. So when you talk about measuring small steps so that you can be sure that it's truly progress, if you don't trust other people to measure, or if you're working to measure the outcomes on your own, it's very important part of that to prove that this adult actually understands, comprehends how to do things functionally to them. They're not just talking. I used to talk about how you can teach birds to answer too, but they, even though they talk, they don't understand. And that's really what I mean when I talk about these things. I appreciate when you say that. Thank you for being part of this. Next slide. I wanted to show you some of the things that we look at for outcomes. Now, some of these are going to be global, across our program. It will be measured by everybody in the program. For example, the percentage of our participants who have jobs or are volunteering. Roughly three quarters, about 75% of our participants are either volunteering somewhere in the community or employed, at least part-time. Very few are employed full-time. There are only a couple of folks that we have right now. They actually are happier, they are more functional because they're busier. But for lots of our participants, they just can't tolerate the stress of working a full-time job. The number of hours that these people work or that they're engaged in volunteer, we want to see that go up. We want to see that be more often. The independence and social skills, very difficult to do, very difficult to measure, because everybody values something a little bit different socially. And so we look for ways to measure this successfully. Sometimes we count the number of different activities that they participate in outside of the house. Will they go to school? Will they get a job? Will they have a hobby that they go to outside of the house? Things like that. Quality of life, there are actually a couple of assessments that we use that measure quality of life. And quality of life is actually all of this other stuff together. It's a composite. It's all of these other little things together. Next slide, please. Here are some of the things that we look to see go away. Involvement with law enforcement, with police. Most people with autism have had at least one encounter with the police. And oftentimes, if there are problems at home and they have anger that is not controllable at home, a lot of times family members will call the police thinking that they will get help if they are either arrested or taken into our criminal justice system. That doesn't turn out to be the case most of the time, but sometimes you have to. So we look for that to go away. Psychiatric emergency room care, the crisis that is not medical in nature but psychiatric in nature. Admission into a psychiatric hospital. Most of our adults have been admitted into psychiatric hospitals over the course of their life. Sometimes for very good reasons, sometimes because they are misunderstood and there's no place else to go. And the crisis intervention plans, everybody who participates in our program has a crisis intervention plan, which means that our staff understands how to behave if this person cannot calm down on their own. And we do everything we can to what we call de-escalate, to calm them down before we get to that crisis stage where there's more of a chance for them to get hurt or someone else to be hurt. Пожалуйста. And here are just a few more of our outcomes. Improvement in access to medical services. Oftentimes, what we find is that behavior changes because people with autism don't feel good. It can be, the easiest way to make this a good example is if an adolescent girl, if a teenage girl or an adult, a female adult has menstrual cycle or hurts or has stomach pain in any way, and she knows she hurts, but she can't describe why or where successfully. People with autism don't report their medical condition, their medical health very successfully at all. And so what ends up happening is they just start to think however they hurt feels normal until it becomes an emergency medically. Or they are so upset and so preoccupied, so distracted by it being uncomfortable or by them hurting, that they end up, their behavior becomes unmanageable and out of control. And after a while, you figure out that, oh my gosh, there's a medical problem too that we should attach to. So everybody in our program has at least one we call them well visits, the preventive checkups, the preventive visits to the doctors at least once a year. And sometimes it depends on what other kinds of health conditions they have, but we help them to monitor their health conditions and to keep track of when they're supposed to go to the physicians or have more appointments and get more consistent treatment. So hopefully, as they age, there will be fewer and fewer health problems over time. Same thing with the dental exams. This is very challenging. And the gynecological exams for young women, we also have them have an annual gynecological exam because we know that there are lots of cancers and diseases that can be prevented if we do that. So we insist that we are able to prepare them to do that successfully. And then when we talk about systemic response and community resources, oftentimes what we find, at least in the United States, is that parents are the ones who advocate, who push for services and for the schools and the local organizations to respond to their needs. Is that true here? Do you find that parents they participate? Спасибо. It's in Pennsylvania especially, but all over the United States, what has happened is that many of the services and many of the new laws that require insurance companies to cover people with autism have developed because parents have gotten together and insisted that it happens. Oftentimes it takes a long time to do that, but they are very important and successful in the service delivery. I have to say, you know, as being a parent, I appreciate being respected as a parent, that not dismissed because I'm a parent, and because I can, you know, I have one foot in both worlds. I can be professional, I can be the parent too. Sometimes parents will allow me to be more, I don't want to say forceful. They will allow me to be a more integral part of their conversation and their family life and their planning, because I understand. And so there's a lot to be learned from parents. You have to look beyond the emotion that they have, but the information that you can get is not available anyplace else. You're talking about people who have lived their entire lives with the person you're trying to serve, and that really does have value. And then we talk about, for the first time in our lifetime, the world is having to identify resources for adults with autism that do not include institutions or services that were truly designed for other populations. We have a number of organizations and services in the United States that were not designed for people with autism, but somebody was responding to a need and thought, oh, it's close enough. Lots of times it's the attention deficit, or sometimes people will, if there are hearing problems or other disabilities that they can see more readily, they will say, oh, we do this so we can take a person with autism successfully. And that's not true. What we find is that the most successful programs were built to be for people with autism, and then added all those other things in too. Added in mental health, added in physical health, added in speech or occupational therapy, those kinds of things. It seems to be more successful to do that. And in the long run, you end up spending. The other thing I talk about often is poverty, because many people with autism today, many adults with autism in our country are homeless, or do not have jobs, or do not receive government help in a way that is successful enough to keep them from being in poverty. There are not enough resources like that, and so that makes a huge difference when people become adults and families believe it's time to give up their responsibility and that they should be responsible for themselves. Poverty makes a huge difference, and people will do what they have to survive. So it's very important to us to make sure that we are respectful and understand that they may truly have no resources. We have lots of people in our program who have been 5 or 6 or 7 years out of their family's home and have been living in places where they didn't need to accumulate their own belongings. And so they can take maybe one bag and move from one organization to the next. And when we are able to transition them to their own apartments, we actually go out and help them buy things to set up their own apartment, dishes and a bed and blankets and things like that. Very basic, you know, it's not very expensive or chic or exciting, but things that they can live. I try to tell our staff, you know, all they wanted to do, we had one woman who moved out recently. She had been 8 years since she had lived with a family member, but she had been living in places where she didn't need to own anything. And so she had some clothes, but that was about it. And the staff just wanted to go and buy her a bed. Please, can we buy a bed? Please, can we buy a bed? And so I looked through our service program and realized that we can help them purchase the things that they need to have a functional household the first time. And I said, please think of this. How would you like to be in an empty apartment with a bed and not even a spoon? Or a dish to eat from, or food and all that stuff. And so I ended up being able to authorize enough money for them to go and buy all of these things. And they were so excited. And I said, you know, please ask her if we can take pictures and show our other participants, yes, you can do this too. And for her, that was the first time in her life that she had made a choice on where she was going to live, and a choice on what she wanted, what belongings she wanted to have, and a choice on what she wanted to do with her life. And so it represented real progress for us. And so I like to be sure that we talk about those kinds of things. I'm at an hour right now.
Okay.
Yeah. I am happy to answer questions. I know that this is kind of a different subject. I hope that the guidelines are useful enough, and you are welcome to email me. You are welcome to email me. I would be very happy to communicate, you know, after the conference is over. It's great to be here. Last time I was here, I was 15 years old. And so it's a little bit different these days. I'm glad to see the Kremlin is still there and Red Square and everything. But I appreciate being here, and I hope to come again someday. Thank you.
Спасибо большое за замечательное выступление. Спасибо, очень было интересно. Я думаю, что есть наверняка у вас вопросы какие-то. Да? Давайте.
Здравствуйте, спасибо за выступление. Меня зовут Светлана, я родитель.
The number of people in our team and the type of people in the team change from person to person based on their needs. Sometimes they will have a speech therapist or an occupational therapist or a physician if they have medical conditions that are very involved, that require a lot of care. After that, in our program, there is always our clinical director, the person in charge of all of the clinical services, but then we have what we refer to as behavioral health specialists. And these people have master's degree. They would be our equivalent to the highly qualified. Many of them have coursework in applied behavior analysis. All of them are required to have several years of experience working with people with autism directly, and not just children. Because it is, you know, in many ways it's different. You have to learn to do things differently. You can't say, oh, I worked in elementary school in you know, 6, 7, 8-year-old children, and then work with adults. So we look for those kinds of folks. Sometimes they will bring attorneys or people who are acting as their guardians legally, who are making those decisions and committing the resources and making the legal decisions if they are not able to do that on their own successfully. So usually 6, 7, 8, could be as many as 10 or 12 sometimes if the family has worked to create a larger environment. Sometimes it's a minister, sometimes an extended relative, an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a peer, a friend that they've had for a long time. So it would be a variety of people. And we find that that's a really good thing because you learn about the person. You start by learning about the person and their history and who they are, and then you build what they need today around that.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы? Тогда спасибо всем большое. Нету больше вопросов, да? Ага.
Sure. It's okay.
Спасибо вам большое. Я 5 лет назад была у вас, Keystone Human Service, да, Чарльз Хукер. Приветы большие. И когда я там была, я тоже мама ребенка с аутизмом. У меня 4 детей, 2 сказали аутизм, на самом деле у одного. Но я поняла это даже 5 лет назад и сейчас, что это мечта, которая у нас, увы, какая бы я ни была оптимистка, она вряд ли в ближайшее время для моих детей сбудется в России. Спасибо вам.
Spasiba.
Спасибо.
It does not mean that it won't happen. And truly, we are the only one like this. And the most important part to understand is no matter what you culturally understand it's successful because the people, the government decided that we should try to have all of the resources in one place so that we need fewer resources in the future and are more successful like that. And so we never thought we'd have anything like this either. This is just not, most of the time people are pushed into the existing systems of service, our mental health service, or some states have systems for developmental disabilities. And those were really the systems that, to be quite honest and very specific, they were the systems built in the 1950s, 1960s for people with mental retardation, very severe disability that needed to be institutionalized. And neither system works well alone. So what we did was put all of those pieces together in one place in order to make it successful. I appreciate what you're saying, but I would say don't ever say never.